All right, great. I'm really excited. This is a dream because I saw you guys on Netflix, and my wife and my daughter and I were sitting there, and I'm like, I know some of those people, not personally, but so this is really exciting that I get a chance to speak to you all. So I'm going to be talking about a theory that I developed about 8 years ago called Mimicry Deception Theory. And I'm going to be talking about its application across a variety of contexts. So the outline of my talk is pretty simple. Since we don't have much time, I'm going to go through mimicry deception theory, the basic idea, and what long and short-term components of the deception look like. I'm going to introduce a scale we developed for self-report that looks at long-term deception. And I'm going to talk briefly about 3 quick applications that we've looked at with respect to mimicry deception theory, which is fraud, cybersecurity, and sex offender profiling. Okay. So deception, animal deception, which I saw we're going to have a really exciting talk later about this as well. So I won't belabor the issue that there are parallels, but all kingdoms of animal organisms, from bacteria all the way up to complexity in primates, have learned to deceive. Okay. This is the HIV virus. Okay. The HIV virus convinces host immune systems that it is innocuous and eventually spreads through the system. Even trees and plants use fungus information superhighways to communicate with each other, and they can send toxins and other materials to neighboring plants. So I want you to all go home and have a long talk with your houseplant, make sure that it's not a psychopath. This is an Australian jumping spider. It uses complex chemical and behavioral mimicry to infiltrate host colonies of ants. When the ants will defend it as one of its own, but when the ants aren't looking, it eats them. This is an anglerfish. It uses dangling apparatus to lure unsuspecting fish toward it. And of course, besides being deceptive, it is horribly ugly. And then humans have engaged in quite a bit of deception throughout history. But there are parallels between the short and the long-term organisms with respect to deception. So this is an influenza virus down at the bottom right-hand corner. And influenza hides behind the spiny columns of the human immune system and just literally pops out and says, hello, I'm here and I'm going to infect you as fast as possible. The anglerfish, again, fish will come close to it, but once bitten, twice shy. It's a one-off type of deception. Fish usually don't fall for it a second time. And then, we've all, at least in the United States, we've seen an uptick in spam and spam calls and robocalls. These are one-off deceptions that generally are mobile spam communities. So short-term deception usually involves superficial visual confusion, immediate and maximum resource extraction, no community integration. So it spans all these communities. It's mobile and it's easily detected. So most people, rather than trying to hide the deception, will just move on. As opposed to the more longer-term deceptions, Ponzi schemes and predatory pricing and antitrust violations, they use more long-term deception. So complex deception, slow and sustainable, if possible, resource extraction, high integration into a community, and difficulty in detection are all components of long-term deception. Okay, but you have to be clever when you engage in deception. Okay. This neither short or long-term deception has anything to do with ability, right? You can have really good ability and be a good short-term deceiver and get very far, okay? So we just published in Journal Personality Assessment a self-reported measure. It breaks into the 4 components of mimicry deception theory. Here are the items. They're free to use for anybody interested. And we kind of try to, at the beginning of the assessment and the instructions, diffuse any defensiveness by saying, look, we've all deceived. So this is not an assessment on whether or not you're deceptive. It's an assessment on when you've been deceptive, how do you approach it, right? And we find that this scale with respect to validity correlates highest among dark triad personality traits. For those familiar, that's Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. It correlates highest with Machiavellianism, which is a strategic form of personality trait with respect to deception. It correlates with planful non-impulsiveness of the Barrett impulsivity scale. And it correlates with conscientiousness, okay, which are important features of being a long-term deceiver. But most importantly, we found in a longitudinal study, complexity of deception predicted being able to keep a lie for at least a week. Individuals who had less complexity in their deception were caught in their lie during that week. So here's a study we did back in 2016, my student Melissa and I. We looked at people who were defrauded. We screened for people who engaged in some form of, or victims of some form of fraud. And we asked them the 4 components in self-reported items: how complex was the deception, how long did the deception go on for? We asked about rapport and how much trust was built prior to the deception. We also asked the question, and I didn't put it up here, but do you still feel you were a victim? Or do you acknowledge that you were a victim? And what we found was the components all correlated as we expected. But most importantly, the correlations predicted, these 4 components predicted more money lost in the fraud over time. And it also correlated with doubting whether or not they were actually a victim. Okay, so still thinking that they're going to get that money back that they loaned Michael, and Michael has deceived them so much that they're still not sure if Michael's a fraudster, right? So we just recently, I'm very excited, just got an NSF grant to study cybersecurity. And one of the things that we're including in our measures is mimicry deception theory. So individuals can approach systems either kind of brute force, bombarding packages and aggressive attacks, or they can be more slithery and stealthy and sneak their way into a system. So we looked at mimicry deception theory in cyber context. So we developed this game called Mafia Raid, where we said, the FBI hired you to hack this mafia group, and how would you like to go about doing it? And we took a validated series of steps that are kind of standard for infiltrating a system. And we asked people, we gave them one at a time, this is what passive reconnaissance is. How would you do it? Would you spend a lot of time on this? Would you spend moderate amount of time, short amount of time, or skip this step? And we asked for all these series of steps of hacking, how they would go about doing it. And what we found was, we looked at a measure of stealthiness, right? So the more time they spent on each step, the stealthier we coded the individual. And what we found was that Machiavellianism, psychopathy, negatively related to, so they were more brute force, narcissism, more brute force. Mimicry deception theory mimicry deception scale was the strongest and best predictor of stealthy attacks that we had in our data set. And for those who are skeptical, these people may not know what they're doing, we replicated this effect in a hackathon with computer programmers, so who were given very explicit instructions and behavioral rewards. So child sex offending. This is really a sensitive topic, but as we all know that sex offenders can really be broken into two categories. The first is, I've got a puppy in my van, I've got candy in my car, I know your mom, superficial kind of deception that approaches a child and kind of kidnaps a child for the purposes of abuse. And then there's the more common case of sexual abuse, which is where the child knows the individual who is an ever-present figure in their life, a coach, a teacher, a scoutmaster, a clergy, somebody who gains, through legitimate occupation or volunteering, gains access to a child and the child's trust and the trust of that community. So my student, Melissa DeRos, has done fantastic work. She actually added a component, which we're going to write another paper kind of validating that soon, of victim selection, right? So who do you target? And she finds that these parallels hold among these different types of sex offenders. So, short-term opportunistic. We just had a chilling case here in Reno by one of the parks of a gentleman driving up in a vehicle and propositioning children for a ride, getting belligerent when the children were kind of hesitating. Thank God none of the children were taken, but we do have a high sex trafficking problem here in Reno. And one of the problems, of course, is that the child will disappear for the purposes of the abuse. And so this is opportunistic. There's very minimal there's just tactical deception just to get the initial compliance rolling. There's very low complexity of that deception. They don't integrate into the community. Nobody knew this guy when they posted his photo. It's usually one episode of abuse or a cluster of small episodes and immediate disclosure. The child knows they were abused. the child immediately is most likely to disclose that abuse of all forms of the abuse, as opposed to the more long-term forms where the individual grooms the child, gaining access. And we define grooming as any behavior that escalates the possibility of abuse taking place. And naturally, grooming is a form of deception because the true intentions of the abuser is hidden from the child under the ruse of some other relationship. You're special, you're the best Cub Scout in the group. I'm gonna take you on a trip, I'm gonna buy you these things. So it uses lies, bribes, manipulation. The abuse goes on for sometimes, and sadly, in many cases, many years. And very often disclosure is either delayed or never happens. So we had my student for her master's thesis accumulated court cases and had blind coders code for the complexity, the detectability, the length of the abuse. And we find again, these components correlate. And it also predicted slower disclosure. So in summary, mimicry deception theory is a useful framework for profiling long-term deception versus short-term deception. Unlike personality, it really has the advantage that these components can be extracted from observed behaviors in addition to self-report. So my student Melissa got access to sting operations from the FBI, chat logs of individuals trying to groom children online for sexual abuse. And again, we find that longer rapport building predicts these other mimicry components. The factors correlate in self-report, fraud, sex offender profiling, and long-term deception predicts unique outcomes such as severity, lasting doubt, and secret-keeping success. We have some future directions. One of the things we're looking at, since I'm in a management program, is job turnover and fraud. We found that individuals who are brokers who have been banned by FINRA for fraudulent trading are more likely to have spanned a number of jobs, and they spend less time at any particular job than individuals who kind of last their whole career without being caught. We're developing a mimicry deception short-term scale. There's some evidence to suggest that long-term and short-term deception are orthogonal components rather than negative poles of the same thing. And then we're developing peer assessment scales as well. And any other ideas or any other future directions, I'm all ears. I just really want to thank my support system, especially Melissa De Ros. I know I'm butchering her last name. She's Dutch, and I apologize, Sophie. But she's a former PhD student, current professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And thank you.